Hey guys, welcome back to Building a Family Business here on Builder Funnel Radio. This week we are going to pick up where we left off last week, and we were trying to dive into a project, and we really felt like we needed to really talk about numbers for about an hour. So Wes, Brooks, welcome back. How's it going, guys?
It's going great. Thanks, man.
Good, good. And well, before we continue, I think we do need to mention that Brooks, happy birthday, man.
Thank you. Yeah.
Happy birthday. We won't say which one it is.
Yeah, it's like
If
30,
I had to
40.
jump out for any moment, it's probably just to meet the delivery driver to receive all my gifts that I'm sure that you guys have sent.
Yep, they're on the way. Although I have been getting those like maybe delayed shipment notifications. So if they don't show up for a few months, yeah, don't worry about it.
Mostly just say canceled.
Canceled. Yeah.
Canceled.
Another gift canceled. Yeah.
Canceled. Yeah, we tried once. That's it.
Yeah.
Done.
So today we wanted to actually dive into a example project. Last week we spent a lot of time going over pro forma and numbers and how to basically analyze, hey, is a project going to work out? And so Brooks, why don't you give us just a little bit of an overview of this kind of case study, kind of what was the premise, what were you guys thinking when you went into it, and just kind of some of the basic components?
Sure. So this project that we're using for today is a 22-unit townhome property, and it's actually a property that we've been owned in the family for, Holy Toledo since 1960. So that's a long time. That's 60 years. And it's in an emerging market in the Seattle metro area. And so we thought, well, we've got this land. Let's see what we could build on it. And we started from scratch, which is we didn't even know what we were going to build on it. So, that was the very first step. So I already gave away it's 22 units, but we didn't even know when we started. So that's where we started, with just a piece of raw land.
Piece of land. Yeah. So let's start there. You've got the land, you're saying, okay, this might be the right time to build something on here. How did you navigate that initial process of arriving at a 22, and you said townhome units, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Wes, when Wes and I sat down and, you start looking at a piece of dirt, the first thing you have to look at is entitlements, and entitlements have to do with zoning, and and then you also look at, well, what's the land going to cost? And so there's a couple things we talked last week about the back of the napkin. So Wes and I sat down first and said, okay, well, what do we think we can get on here? And the first step is you call your engineer or your architect, or someone, you call a friend who says, and first ask, hey, do you have an engineer or an architect? And then Wes and I sat down and started thinking about, okay, what could we build on there? And so Wes, what you could talk about those financial numbers that we started to put together after we got that first piece of information, which is densities somewhere between 22 to 35 units,
right,
on this piece of property. So a big range.
Yeah, big range. And you kind of walk through and do that back of the napkin, and you really do that range. You run those numbers at 35 and you run them at 22, and because you really don't know, you're just trying to figure out, is this worth spending any time on? Is this now something that we should at least go to the next step and try to figure out, put a little bit of effort and money into it to see if you're really going to have something here that's viable. So that's really all you're doing. And so when we did the back of the napkin, we certainly didn't know if it was going to be 35 or 22 or something in between. It was just based on the zoning, what we thought we could get on there at the time before we'd done anything else.
I think the thing we'll want to circle back to in the end, because it became critical in this project, is we started this undertaking on this piece of land with a kind of like, well, yeah, we think we want to do some development here, and we think we want to build something here, and that's how we started it. So that's going to become important as we get sort of foreshadowing for you.
Yes, nice.
Will get important later.
You're really
later.
hooking the listeners here. For
That's right. We have to have a little mystery, right?
Yeah, a little mystery going on.
Well, before we get to the mystery, I'm curious, did you guys initially go, oh, should we build an apartment building or should we build townhomes or something else? Or I guess I'm wondering, did you guys look at the market and kind of how did you arrive at townhomes versus something else?
Well, the way we did it and the way you really typically do it is what's the underlying zone that affects this piece of property. So if you're driving along and you see, gee, there's, triplex, fourplex, duplex, vacant lot, triplex, duplex, fourplex, it's pretty easy to look up in the city code or the county code and say, oh, this is zone multifamily, 4 units or less, or it's multifamily, and they'll lay out what you can build there. And the beauty of it now is you can just look that up, on the internet and find out. Oh, okay, they'll hold multifamily, townhomes, apartments, multi-story, up to 6 stories, and all that information is there. And so you can just start by looking at that and going, oh, well, what could I do? And you don't have to engage an architect. You don't have to engage a engineer. And the reason I bring up both an architect and an engineer is you need both to figure out, what you can actually get on the property. So that's the way you start. So you just look and say, okay, well, what's around me? Looks like I can build the same thing. And that's why Wes and I sat down and said, okay, well, it looks like we get as small as this to as big as this, and ran those numbers on the back of the napkin.
Gotcha.
And obviously, in this case, because the property had been in the family for 60 years, it's a lot easier to make that sort of a project work because your land basis is so low, so those types of, but it may be that when you're out driving around and looking at pieces of dirt and you're seeing stuff that is for sale, or maybe it's not for sale, but you're going to contact the owner and see if they're willing to do something, then those numbers become a lot more important because you don't have as much squish, I guess, in the project if you haven't owned the property for a long time and there's been a lot of inflation.
So one of the things you want to do in this kind of an iterative process is that a lot of these things are moving at the same time. So if you're a very sequential person, it's step 1, step 2, step 3. This process can be a little bit more broad. It can be broader in that you can be looking on the internet and say, oh, what could I build here? You could be calling a real estate agent that and say, hey, what's land trading at for multifamily? You could be calling your engineer and saying any crazy stormwater requirements in this area. You kind of start collecting this information as you're ruminating about it, as you're driving around, working your day, and then you start to pull it together into that pro forma.
Yeah, that's where that checklist is really handy because you've got, basically you're going to answer, hey, what do I need to know? That's the question you're answering. What do I need to know? Is there water? Is there sewer? Is there gas? Is there, what's happening in the area? So there's just a ton of questions that, as Brooks was saying, you can jump in and start checking those boxes and getting some of those things answered and closing down those unknowns. And the more of the unknowns that you close down, the closer you are to having a project. But until you get all those boxes checked, all those questions answered, you really don't have something to go with.
And so as you guys got going, you were saying, okay, we like the townhome route. We think it's going to be 22 to 35 units, and you're starting to run your numbers on the back of the napkin. Were you guys thinking originally going into it as these were going to be townhomes for rent or townhomes for sale? And how were you running the numbers that way?
I think we're strictly looking at for rental. That's the only reason this property was really still in the family and had been built on and sold was because the thought would be, hey, at some point this would be a good investment piece of property for the family, build some more apartments, something that we can rent and hold, see some appreciation in the asset. So, and that may not be true for everyone, but I mean, essentially we talked about in other podcasts, hey, you've got your engine that runs over here, either doing remodeling or building. That's what you use for selling stuff. And that's how you generate your cash. And then over on the other side, you've got, okay, I'm trying to build some assets for retention. And so this is really over on that other side, assets for retention.
Yeah, and there's different theories. I mean, we can talk about, which is, hey, we could have built this and then sold the whole project, used that capital. You could have levered up and taken the money we earned from building that, buying something bigger. And then you could go from a 22 unit, sell it, and all of a sudden you're buying a 48 unit or something like that. Because in our market, there's so much construction liability through sales. We weren't interested in undertaking a sales process and stepping into that liability of selling off the assets and then using it in some other asset. Much better just to build on our own account and just build and hold. But I think we need to circle back to that first step, which is so critical, which if you just the first time you built a building or the first time you developed, is that a designer can draw a building that'll maximize the utility of the land. Most markets today have a lot of requirements for park space, play space, parking, and storm. And the thing that if you're in a market where they don't have a lot of storm requirements, or maybe you're hearing about it, storm will eat your lunch for space. And that's where the engineer and the designer have to work together to do those preliminary meetings. So you very quickly get to a point where you need to have a rough design based on storm, based on loading, and you got to get in with the city and have a meeting with the city or the county and find out what are they going to require. And so that that's usually $2 or $3 grand to have that meeting. Plus you spent $6 or $7 or $8 grand with your engineer and your designer. So you after you run the back of the napkin, you're going to have to write a few checks to get there to just determine even if you should spend any more money.
So is that? Oh, go ahead, Wes.
Oh, I was just going to say that Brooks brings up an interesting point, and this is probably true for most markets, which is your zoning says, yep, I can divide that square footage or whatever it is by the requirement in the code and come up with X number of units. And that's really where we came up with the 35 units, and of course, at the end of the day, we're at 22 units. So that kind of tells you the impact of all these other things that have come along. But each area is going to have their restrictions. So Brooks mentioned storm. Well, in the Seattle area, storm water, there's a lot of water. It's a big thing. So if you have to build big vaults to hold water on the site and then disperse it out, that's going to be a huge cost. But somewhere else, it might be a restriction about water supply. Maybe there isn't enough water. Like out in the Colorado area, there's definitely water restrictions or things that could cause people to have trouble developing to the full maximum potential of the zoning. So every area is going to be unique that way. It could be fire, it could be, but probably in your area, there's something that's going to cause you to not be able to maximize the full zoning potential. So anyway, and that can be a problem with a negotiation with a seller because they're going, oh, well, hey, my zoning says this, so I can absolutely, get this much per unit. And like, well, not really. That's why.
Well, we had a deal we did for a 15-unit townhome project that we were buying the land and building it and keeping it. And we've talked about it in previous podcasts, but it ended up being 10 units instead of 15. But I bought it based on 15. By the time I got through the city process, it was 10. So it was my mistake for not going all the way through the process of the city before I closed on the land. I thought, oh, I'm far enough along. And so, again, critical thing is don't close till you have your permits. Because once you own the land, there's no going back. It's
right.
Pretty hard to back up.
There's no do-overs.
Yeah, that backup bell you hear, that's the bus backing over you. Yeah.
Right.
Painful.
So in this scenario, you basically went in back of the napkin 35 units, and then you started having the drawings done because you already had the land. And then as they get the drawings done, then you start working with the city or the county, and then that's where it started ratcheting back because you realized.
Actually, we ratcheted it back beforehand. So
okay.
you self ratchet, because what happens is you do your design work just very rough. I mean, you start out with your architect just sketching something out based on the square footage, the land use. It's 5 units to the acre, 20 units to the acre, whatever it is, and then that you're taking to your engineer and saying, okay, here's what we think we can do land use wise. Tell us what we can do, storm, retention, things like that. Your designer should bring to the table, here's how many units we can get on here. City or county code is you got to have a play space, you got to have so many parking units. They really take care of that. Then that designer works together with the engineer and they work out back and forth. Oh, okay, typically we need X amount of parking spots. We need this much detention on site. We could put it in the road. We could put it, over this open space. In our market, most of our detention has been in vaults in the last 20 years. Previous to that, it was in open detention ponds. And so now it's actually going back to more bioswales, filtration ponds, things like that. Actually a vault's great because you can park on top of a vault, and we actually like vaults better. They're just super expensive. A vault in our market could cost $200,000. So it's just they're crazy expensive.
Well, you don't have to spend. What you don't want to do is jump ahead of the process and have your architect actually drawing up the specific unit and trying to figure out, oh, I'm going to put a bathroom here, and this is going to be a cool unit. So you're going to do what Brooks was referring to, which is a loading study. So the loading study is basically blocks. They're going to say roughly if you got a 1,200 square foot unit or a 600 square foot unit, we can kind of fit them in this kind of configuration. But in terms of what the marketing design would look like and all of that, you're not going to get there because you don't know if you can do it yet. And I think that's a mistake that it's pretty easy to make early on. When you're first doing this, you think, okay, I'm going to run all the way through this process. And so you get pretty excited about some of those details that are at the end that you may never make it there. So don't spend, your gunpowder on that. Make sure you're spending that money up front with the right things, which is the loading study, talking to the engineer, seeing all the things that are going to cut back the unit count.
So you got to be circling back constantly, trying to figure out with your loading study what things are going to work. You might have started with 30 units, 1,200 square feet. You figure out that we can only do 20 units and they have to be smaller or maybe larger. And that's really when you get involved with if you have your own property management company, you're talking to your leasing people. If you don't, you're talking to property managers in the area that are pretty active, and you're finding out what are they thinking, what are they seeing, what do they see in the future, because there's a good chance you're not going to be bringing this product on for 2 years. I think that's one of the biggest challenges is you're trying to figure out what's going to be going on in the economy 2 to 3 years out, and something that's going to be sustainable, over time.
Yeah, I'd imagine that gets a little tricky when you think about trends and design and layout and stuff like that too. If you're forecasting a couple of years out, do you find that it's better to take a more evergreen approach with some of those design elements?
Well, I think one of the things you can do, and this is something Wes can talk about a little bit, we had a project that was 50 years old, and we went through and redeveloped it this last year, and some neat things came out of that we did, design wise and finishes. So Wes, if you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, sure, it was a pretty nice project, turned out pretty well. I mean, essentially all we did was go back into the units, and we looked at the outside of the building and said, hey, it has kind of that retro 60s vibe to it, and which luckily for us is pretty popular right now, mid-century modern and all that kind of stuff. So we just went through and retweaked the building, new cabinets, lighting fixtures, paint, and just brought it all up. It looked super sharp, and we're able to pick up substantially more rent by doing that. So you do have to think about your projects and think, well, this isn't going to be, whatever the design is, it's not going to be forever. So, it's kind of a fine line. It just depends on how long you're going to hold the building for. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know you guys have always taken a long-term approach with most of the projects, and so you get into it knowing, hey, this will be a solid design for 3, 5, 10 years, whatever it is, but eventually you'll probably have to make some of those adjustments down the road.
Yeah, market's going to change, and you'll end up having to do that.
So in terms of this project that we've been walking through, I guess let's go through kind of the takeaways and some of the details and just kind of summarize what happened. So like how much cash went into the deal? Did you eventually move through? Why did you end up stopping? Those kinds of things. What happened, after going through all of these steps?
Well, in terms of cash, we had about $50,000, I think, in cash into the project in engineering, preliminary studies, things like that. And so, spoiler alert, so the project didn't go forward, but, and Brooks can talk a little bit about why that was, but of course, that's money that when you go into a project, you're going to see that project and you may or may not get that money back. And lots of times you don't, so in this case, that money is still invested in the project. The longer it is till we develop that project, the less of a return we'll get on that 50 grand, because we might have to redo some of that work that we did at one point. If you do a market study and then you don't do it for 5 years, well, you're going to update that market study, and you're going to have to redo some of those things, or you might have to redo the loading study as things change in your municipality.
Yeah, I think the thing to remember is the longer you own and hold a piece of property, the less property rights you have, because as time moves on, things change, water rights change, sewage changes, traffic changes, and as your county or city gets denser, then the governing bodies will take away property rights and most likely decrease your zoning versus increase it. Every once in a while you can get upzoned, but that doesn't happen very often. So it is, if you're looking at buying something, look at trying to move through that relatively quickly so that you capture the property right. So if you bought something that's going to be a 35 unit, you want to move on through it so it doesn't end up being a 20 unit or something just due to city changes. So as we move through this project, the project actually probably worked fine. It took us about 18 months to get from what do we want to build on it to what we could build on it and have some design ideas. And so we had invested about $50,000 and spent 18 months to move through that. And it just takes that long in our jurisdiction to get to the point where you could actually draw something and go in for a permit. And our permit process in this county was actually a 2-year process. So we would have had 18 months into the prelim, decided to go, and then probably another 2 years to actually get a permit. So we did our preliminary numbers and ran through potentially, construction costs and what returns might be. And what ended up happening is that the investors who were interested in moving on the project were really not as gung-ho as we thought that they were. And so we didn't have the funding to move forward. So it goes to, knowing if you're not controlling the money, then you have to make sure that you have buy-in from your investors all the way through as you move forward. And if that's something that's difficult to do projects that you can just control the money on and you don't have to go back to investors. I don't know, Wes, others.
Well, I think you certainly, you need to be able to control the money or be able to go to get alternate sources of funding, but you also need to control the dirt. So, and that, I think really that ultimately is what turned this project upside down, is that as minority owners on the dirt, we didn't have the ultimate say on whether we should move forward on that project or not, because we could have found alternate funding sources, I think, for sure. But if you don't control the dirt, you don't control the project. So, and that's just a hard lesson.
And that would go back to also, in this case, this was a piece of dirt that had been in the portfolio a long time. But if you're just getting started and you're like, oh, I want to try to find a piece of dirt to build on, then tie up that dirt with a contract, a purchase and sale contract that has lots of feasibility time, lots of time to close, so you can do your work. And if you think it's going to take 2 years before you're ready to close, you write the deal that way and then move forward with giving yourself some outs along the way. I think that's and then you do control the dirt, and then you could work on the investor side. I don't know, Wes, what you.
Well, I think yeah, I agree with all of that. But I think on the flip side, Brooks, you had talked about earlier about the project that you had done where you were down zoned, or certainly the city got in there and they reduced the number of units for you, and you decided to close and move forward with the project anyway. And in that example, you were kind of going, well, man, that wasn't maybe the best idea to close before you had everything absolutely lined up. But on the other hand, I think if you are writing a deal, or do make sure that you can waive any of those things that you personally put into that deal and say, okay, I'm waiving all of these requirements and I'm going to close. Because you do want to have that option. So you really do want it both ways. You want to have the time and you want to have the outs, but you also want to have the ability to waive all of those outs and go ahead and close. Because there may be a particular situation where you actually do want to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Wes. You always want to be able to waive all your conditions and move towards closing whenever you're ready to do that. You might decide that if something could really change, and all of a sudden this property got way more valuable than you had anticipated, and all of a sudden the seller's like, whoa, I want to get out of this deal because I could resell it for more money. And that doesn't happen all the time, but we've had projects where you're dealing with an estate and where you're dealing with a landowner who passes on during the feasibility, and then the estate doesn't want to close, but we do want to close. And so you do want to have that ability to close if you want to. So it's like Wes said, you're trying to have both sets of conditions set up so it works for you the best. And in a super hot market, that's hard to do when people are paying cash for land. But hopefully everybody's market's a little more balanced and they can write a balanced deal.
Yeah, I think those are good takeaways. It seems like we started with the back of the napkin, you start going through all these numbers and you're just penciling out, but then you kind of hit this tipping point where if you're going to start dropping in some money and making some moves, you want to have these things in place, knowing that you have the control or you have multiple options to get funding, or some of these things that you guys just went through, because there's lots of ways the deal can implode if you haven't thought through some of those, even if they're rarer or there's a small chance. But if there's 10 things like that have a small chance, then you're bound to bump into one of those. So it sounds like that's the main takeaway here was you guys had almost everything ironed out, but then there were a couple of things that just caused it to put it on hold and discontinue. So are you guys looking at this piece of land for the future, or was it kind of like, hey, we kind of explored that and now it's on the back burner for a while again?
Well, it's still in the portfolio, so it certainly can always be in play, and so never say never. So I would imagine at some point this land will either get sold or get developed. May not be developed by Brooks or myself. Hey, Spence, maybe you can develop it. So.
I don't know. This sounds like a really lengthy process. Yeah.
It's not for the faint. It's not for the faint of heart. That's for sure. So I think that's the takeaway is someone's getting started. They're thinking about time frame, timeline, amount of cash they have available, investors, and thinking about those things, and how much time in terms of on the calendar, but almost how much time they have to spend on it when they're doing other things in their business.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's wrap up this case study here. Just with some final thoughts, Wes. As you reflect back on this, how would you either summarize it or just a quick parting thought on this one?
Sure. Well, they say a learning experience is anything that costs you money. So, we chalked this one down to a learning experience. And we did learn a lot. And so I think as you're looking at projects, just make sure that you think about what are some of the unexpected things that could happen, and don't, in your enthusiasm for a project, don't forget some of the fundamentals. Do I have my ownership structure in place? Do I have my funding in place? Those different types of things. And then also, how far am I willing to go, and how much money am I willing to invest, and still recognize that I can walk away from that and I'm going to pull the plug. So you got to know what that number is in your head. Otherwise, you can go in a little bit deeper than you might want to get into it, and that can cause you problems for your next project. So those are some of my takeaways, I guess. How about you, Brooks?
My takeaways would be, as you're sitting down to think about projects, think about, have conversations with whomever else you're partnering with, whether that's your significant other, it's business partners, and sit down and run through some scenarios, over lunch, which is, hey, if we were out to go out and look for something, how much are people willing to invest? And how much are you willing to walk away from? And try to run those out. And because you've done the back of the napkin, hey, we might have to bring in 500 grand in cash to this deal. Well, then find out from everybody who's participating, at what point are they willing to do that? Are they willing to do that? And kind of flush that out ahead of time. Once you've figured out your financing structure and how much cash you have to work with, then you're able to go and look for projects. Otherwise, you look for things you can't afford. So it's better to look for stuff you can afford. If you've got 10 grand, what can you do with 10? If you've got 20, what can you do with 20? If you've got 10 and you've got a friendly person who'd like to loan you 100, okay, so those are the things you have to really find out what people will really do, not just what they're going to talk about over a beer or something. Oh yeah, I'd give you 10 grand. It's like, okay, well then you take it to the next level and get people to really sit down in a business setting and commit and say, okay, if I put this together, are you in? And then you get something a little roughed up, and then you have people write their checks early, and that tends to keep people more committed. So that's probably a big takeaway there.
Cool. Yeah. Well, good takeaways, and thank you guys for walking through this case study. I'm hoping that for those of you listening, that this helped out in terms of, kind of that start to at least completion, or figuring out, hey, this isn't going to work out for one reason or another. So yeah, appreciate you guys listening, and please go ahead and leave us a review if you haven't already, and definitely send us some feedback over at radio@builderfunnel.com. Send us a note, send us a question if there's something you guys want us to dive into in future episodes. And with that, we'll see you guys next week on Builder Funnel Radio.